People mistake Filipinos for Mexican, Hawaiian, or Indian, and there's a genetic reason why. It starts with a Spanish law. In 1849, a Spanish governor forced thousands of Chinese-descended Filipino families to give up their real names for ones like Santos, Cruz, Reyes, and Tan. That single decree is why so many classic Filipino surnames aren't Filipino at all, and aren't Spanish either. They're the fingerprint of a decision made in one year, for one bureaucratic reason, and it still sits on almost every ID card, birth certificate, and passport across the diaspora today. So how did a 19th century paperwork order end up rewriting an entire nation's identity, down to the very name people still get mistaken over? It starts almost 1,000 years earlier with traders who never meant to stay, and it ends with a national hero whose own bloodline the record tried to erase. Long before Spain ever reached these islands, Chinese merchants were already sailing south to trade. From at least the 9th century, trading junks loaded with fine goods left China's southern Fujian coast for the archipelago that would one day be called the Philippines. The locals called these traders Sangley, a word borrowed from a Hokkien phrase for frequent business, and that description was exact: seasonal, recurring, and for both sides, profitable enough to keep coming back to, year after year, for centuries. For most of that history, the relationship never went further than the docks. Traders arrived with the monsoon winds, exchanged their goods for gold and local produce, and sailed home before the season turned. There was no colony to answer to, no permanent settlement to defend, and no reason for anyone involved to imagine this arrangement would ever look any different than it had for the last 300 years. Then in 1565, Spain arrived and planted a flag on Cebu, and within 2 decades, everything about the Sangley presence changed. The new colonial government needed precisely what these traders had spent centuries building: supply chains that worked, artisans who understood local demand, and a network of contacts stretching back to the mainland that no Spaniard could replicate from scratch. Spain did not just want Manila as a fort, it wanted the invisible economy Chinese traders had built long before any Spaniards set foot on these shores. Picture what that meant on the ground. A colonial power with soldiers, priests, and galleons had almost no idea how to feed a growing city, build its houses, or move its goods without the very traders it had just placed under its own flag. The dependency ran one direction on paper, and the opposite direction in practice, and that contradiction never got fully resolved. It just got managed, one uneasy arrangement at a time, for the next 300 years. By the 1580s, Manila was a Spanish colonial capital that could not physically function without Chinese labor, Chinese goods, and Chinese capital. Skilled Sangley tradesmen built and supplied the very galleons that would carry Manila's silver and silk trade across the Pacific to Mexico, a connection with its own story, one this channel will pick up soon. So the colonial government did what so many governments dependent on a population they distrust have done throughout history. It welcomed the labor and feared the people attached to it. In 1581, Spanish authorities built the Parian, a walled trading district just outside Manila's fortified core, purpose-built to hold the growing Chinese community close enough to tax and trade with, and far enough away to police. By some estimates, the Parian held tens of thousands of residents at its peak. More people crowded into a single quarter than lived in most European towns of that era, packed into narrow streets lined with trading stalls that Spanish friars described in their letters home with a mixture of fascination and open distrust. That distrust was never about commerce, it was about numbers. Chinese residents in and around Manila routinely outnumbered Spanish colonists by ratios historians still argue over today, sometimes estimated at 10 to 1 or higher, inside a colony that depended entirely for its food, its buildings, and its trade, on the very population it feared most. That imbalance would not stay quiet for long. Walls built to contain a community tend to reveal how nervous the people building them really are. Because outside the walls of the Parian, something the colonial government had never planned for was already happening. Slowly, generation by generation, Chinese men were marrying local Filipino women, and their children were becoming an entirely new kind of person, one with no clean box to fit into on any Spanish census form. Mestizo de Sangley, part Chinese, part Filipino, legally neither and administratively inconvenient. This wasn't a footnote unique to one colony. Across maritime Southeast Asia, the same pattern repeated wherever Chinese traders settled long enough among local populations to intermarry and raise families. In the Malay world, that same blend of Chinese ancestry and local custom produced the Peranakan, the Baba Nyonya communities of the Straits settlements, whose descendants still identify as a distinct culture today with their own cuisine, dress, and a language blending Hokkien with Malay. The Philippines version of that story had its own name, its own hybrid Hokkien Tagalog dialect, its own food traditions still served on Filipino tables today, and its own unresolved legal status in a colony that had no idea what to do with people who belonged, at once, to both worlds and neither. If tracing a bloodline this tangled through 5 centuries of trade, conquest, and intermarriage is the kind of history that keeps you up reading old archives at 2 a.m., subscribe now, because that's precisely what this channel does every single week. Real published genetics and real archival paper trails, never the folklore version most textbooks settle for. That unresolved legal status turned violent in 1603. Spanish authorities, already anxious about a Chinese population that vastly outnumbered them inside and around Manila, moved against the Sangley community after months of rising tension boiled over into open conflict. What followed was one of the deadliest events in early colonial Philippine history. A massacre that historians estimate killed somewhere in the range of 20,000 people or more, with some accounts placing the toll even higher. The exact number isn't settled science and probably never will be, but even the conservative estimates describe one of the largest single episodes of mass violence in the archipelago's colonial history. The massacre should have ended the relationship for good. A community had just been violently reduced by the government that depended on it for nearly everything, and every Sangley trader left standing had watched firsthand how that government really viewed the people who kept its economy running. Instead, within a single generation, Chinese traders and their Mestizo descendants were back in force, rebuilding the supply lines, the shops, the intermarried families, because Manila still needed them just as much as they needed Manila, and neither side had anywhere else to go. This is the part of the story that rarely makes it into the shorter version people tell each other. It's not a tale of a colony that gradually assimilated a foreign population over time, but of a relationship the two sides survived, over and over, through massacre, mistrust, and mutual need, because the alternative for both of them was worse. Smaller flare-ups of the same suspicion resurfaced across the following 2 centuries, echoes of 1603 on a reduced scale, each one followed by expulsion, return, and cautious economic reintegration. The underlying math never changed. A colony this dependent on Chinese trade and labor could punish the community that provided it, but could never actually replace it. Survive it and rebuild, that pattern would repeat again in a very different and far subtler form, 2 centuries later. Across that same long stretch of decades, something remarkable happened to the Mestizo de Sangley community. Barred from many of the trades and offices reserved for full-blooded Spaniards, and no longer treated as purely foreign traders either, these families found their advantage precisely in the gap between categories, in the commerce, land deals, and local trade networks that nobody else on the colonial social ladder was positioned to run. Prominent Mestizo families steadily became landowners, moneylenders, and local power brokers across Luzon and the Visayas. Chinese surnames, already Romanized generations earlier at baptism, began appearing on land titles, church registries, and eventually provincial power lists, threaded through colonial paperwork that never fully acknowledged where those families had actually come from. These families didn't seize total dominance of the colonial economy, nor did they vanish into quiet erasure. What they made instead was a slow generational climb, built by a community that had already survived exile inside its own home and had learned the hard way how precarious its place there could still be. What made this climb unusual is that it happened almost entirely without the legal protections full Spanish citizens took for granted. These families built wealth and standing while still carrying a legal status, somewhere between colonizer and colonized, trusted enough to lend money to Spanish landowners, never trusted enough to be treated as fully Spanish themselves. That contradiction, wealth without full legal belonging, is the kind of tension colonial administrators eventually decide they need to resolve on paper, even if resolving it on paper does nothing to resolve it in practice. And that climb, that decades-long accumulation of land, capital, and unspoken local influence is what set the stage for the single decision that would define Filipino surnames forever, for every family in the islands, Mestizo or not. By the time the 19th century arrived, colonial administrators weren't looking at a small foreign trading colony anymore. They were looking at generations of intermarried, land-holding, deeply rooted families whose names, on paper, told the Spanish government almost nothing useful about who anyone actually was. That administrative frustration is what would finally boil over into the decree that changed everything. In 1849, Governor General Narciso Clavería y Zaldúa signed one of the strangest bureaucratic documents in Philippine colonial history, the Catálogo alfabético de apellidos, an alphabetical catalog of Spanish surnames, printed and distributed province by province, page by page, almost like a phone book handed out by decree, with a fixed list of names assigned to each town in order. His stated reason was administrative chaos. Filipino families across the islands had been repeating the same handful of religious names for generations: de los Santos, de la Cruz, de los Reyes, until Spanish tax collectors and parish priests genuinely could not tell one family apart from the next in their own official records. Clavería's fix was total and immediate. Assign every Filipino household, Mestizo and indigenous alike, a unique surname pulled directly from his catalog, whether that family wanted a new name or not. The mechanics of it were almost absurdly bureaucratic. Officials worked through the catalog in order, town by town, handing out surnames alphabetically so that neighboring households often ended up with names starting with the same letter, an administrative side effect still visible in some provincial surname clusters today. It was never framed as an attack on any single group's identity. It was framed, on paper, as tidiness. That framing is why its effect on one specific community, the Mestizo de Sangley families, went almost entirely unremarked at the time. For Mestizo de Sangley families specifically, this decree had an effect almost nobody talks about today. Whatever Chinese name a family had carried for generations, already Romanized and passed down carefully through baptismal records, was now simply replaced on the official page. Overnight, on paper, a Chinese lineage that had survived trade, intermarriage, and even a massacre was rewritten in Spanish letters, filed, stamped, and closed, with no appeal and no exception. The bloodline underneath never changed by a single strand of DNA. Only the name legally attached to it did, permanently, for every generation that followed. That single decree is the reason Santos, Cruz, and Reyes, read today as unmistakably, purely Filipino, when the families carrying them may trace, if you follow the paper trail far enough back, straight through Fujian province, and not through Spain at all. Multiply that single Mestizo de Sangley story by the thousands of households the catalog processed, town by town, across the entire archipelago, and you start to understand the real scale of what 1849 actually did. It wasn't one family's story. It was the single largest identity rewrite in the island's colonial history, executed with a printed list and a signature, and almost nobody living today was ever taught to look for it. And this is where the policy stops being an abstract footnote, because one of the families it rewrote produced the most famous Filipino who ever lived. José Rizal, the national hero whose face is printed on Philippine currency and whose novels helped ignite the revolution against Spain itself, descended paternally from a man named Lam-co, a trader from Chinchu in China's Fujian province. Lam-co was baptized Domingo at San Gabriel Church in Binondo in 1697 and later settled in Banan, Laguna on land tied to a local Dominican estate, where he married a Chinese mestiza named Inés de la Rosa. It was a later generation of that same family, not Lam-co himself, that eventually relocated from Banan to Calamba, the town every biography names as Rizal's actual birthplace. Even the correction some history-literate Filipinos already know, that the family arrived in Calamba in 1697, slightly compresses the real timeline. 1697 is the year of the Binondo baptism, not the year of the Calamba arrival, which came a full generation later. The precise chain runs Fujian, to Binondo, to Banan, to Calamba, and getting that chain right matters because it means the man who wrote the novels that helped birth Philippine nationalism carried precisely the kind of Chinese mestizo lineage that Clavería's decree was busy legally erasing from the record just decades before Rizal himself was even born. Look at the timing. The decree that flattened Chinese mestizo surnames into Spanish ones was signed in 1849. Rizal was born in 1861, barely a dozen years later, into a family whose own paperwork had already been rewritten by the very system he would grow up to challenge. He didn't inherit a simple Filipino identity handed down cleanly through history. He inherited a stitched-together one: Chinese trade, Spanish paperwork, and indigenous land, all compressed into a single surname that told none of that story on its own. Rizal wasn't an isolated case either. Some of the most recognizable family names in modern Philippine business and politics trace through this exact same Mestizo de Sangley current. Romanized Chinese names carried down through generations of intermarriage, land, and quiet influence. Long before anyone in those families ever imagined a Spanish decree would try to rename the ones who came before them. The pattern that produced a national hero's bloodline is the same pattern sitting underneath a huge share of the country's most powerful surnames today. So here's the uncomfortable question worth sitting with for a minute. If the father of Filipino national identity descended from a Chinese trader whose family name was legally erased by the same colonial system he'd later die resisting, whose story is the authentic Filipino one, and who gets left out of it entirely? Type your answer in the comments below, because arguments like this one are why this channel exists in the first place. Modern genetics backs up what that 8-generation paper trail already suggests. A 2014 study published in BMC Genetics, led by researcher Jean Tregeau, examined Y chromosome lineages across the Philippines and identified the marker O2A, 2B, P164, linked to Chinese and other East and Southeast Asian paternal ancestry in roughly 17.8% of a large pooled Filipino sample. That figure isn't flat across the country either. It runs closer to 18% in South Luzon, climbs past 22% across the Visayas, and reaches as high as 50% in parts of Mindanao, a regional spread that lines up closely with where Sangley trade routes and Mestizo settlement concentrated most heavily over 4 centuries. That marker doesn't translate into a clean % Chinese headline, and no honest genetics paper claims it does. What it actually shows is that a meaningful share of Filipino paternal lineages trace back to East Asian ancestors, layered on top of the island's far older Austronesian and indigenous roots, exactly the kind of layered ancestry the Clavería surname records physically buried under a single page of borrowed Spanish names. If you've taken an Ancestry DNA or 23andMe test and seen an unexpected East Asian percentage sitting inside an otherwise all Filipino result, this is very likely why. It isn't a lab error, and it isn't a coincidence. It's the same paper trail traced earlier in this video, showing up as a number on a results page instead of a name in a colonial catalog. This is why genetics and genealogy have to be read together, not separately. A surname alone tells you what a colonial catalog decided to call a family in 1849. A Y chromosome marker tells you something the catalog never touched at all. Put both together, and a supposedly simple Spanish surname like Cruz or Santos stops looking simple and starts looking like a compressed 3-part history that the name itself was specifically designed to hide. And the Philippines wasn't alone in running this kind of erasure. Indonesia carried out its own version of the same policy 3 centuries later, when a 1966 government decision forced ethnic Chinese Indonesians across the archipelago to adopt Indonesian-sounding names. Almost the same mechanism, a different government, a different century, driven by the same underlying instinct. Officials deciding that a population's foreign-rooted surnames were a problem that paperwork alone could solve. Line those 2 decrees up side by side, 1849 in Manila and 1966 in Jakarta, and a pattern comes into focus that has nothing to do with either country specifically. Whenever a government inherits a population it can't cleanly categorize, the paperwork tends to win, and the deeper, mixed history underneath tends to get filed away and forgotten, at least until someone bothers to go looking for it again. Some Filipino families see this on their own kitchen table, without ever running a test. Siblings raised by the same 2 parents can look like they came from entirely different countries, lighter and finer featured, or built like they'd pass for Northern Chinese, or reading as fully indigenous, all in one household. Families joke about it. Sometimes a child grows up quietly wondering if they were adopted, until a parent finally pulls out the birth certificate to settle it. Adoption was never the answer. The real one is the layered ancestry laid out earlier in this video, handed out unevenly among siblings for the same reason it shows up unevenly across regions, 18% in the north, 50% in Mindanao, the same inheritance simply dealt to each child in a different mix. Today, millions of Filipinos carrying Pinoy ancestry, Chinese Filipino identity, still navigate that same layered inheritance every single day, often without realizing how it got built in the first place. A Spanish name sits on the birth certificate. A Chinese lineage sits in the family altar. In Hokkien phrases grandparents still use at dinner, in Lunar New Year traditions kept alive inside otherwise thoroughly Catholic households. And underneath both of those layers sits the island's original Austronesian foundation, the oldest thread in the whole braid. None of these three layers cancel each other out, and none of them make the others less real. A family can light incense for ancestors on one weekend and walk to Sunday Mass the next, carry a Spanish surname assigned by decree, and still trace, through DNA and through paperwork both, straight back to a trader who sailed south from Fujian centuries before any of it was written down. None of this is folklore, and none of it needed a DNA kit to prove it existed. It was sitting the entire time in baptismal registries, in a governor's 1849 catalog, and in a national hero's own family tree, waiting for anyone willing to read the paperwork instead of the myth. And that's really the core of this whole story. Not that Filipino identity is somehow less real for being layered, but that it was never the single clean bloodline the surname on anyone's ID card quietly implies. Every Santos, every Cruz, every Reyes is carrying a compressed version of the history we just walked through, whether their family ever knew it or not. So the next time somebody tells you Filipino identity is one simple bloodline, one clean story, remember Rizal's actual family tree. Remember the Catálogo alfabético de apellidos sitting in a Manila archive, and remember that Santos might be one of the most Chinese surnames in the entire Philippines, just wearing a disguise that's had 175 years to become permanent. A single governor's signature in 1849 didn't just organize a colony's paperwork. It reshaped how an entire nation would read its own bloodline for the next century and a half, and most people carrying that rewritten name never got to hear the rest of the story this video just told. So here's the question this whole video started with. What ethnicity do people mistake you for? And how close does it actually land to the real answer? Put it in the comments below, along with your own family's surname story, whether it's Chinese, Spanish, indigenous, or something the records never fully explained. We read every one, and this channel's next episode might just answer it. And if this is the part of Philippine history your textbooks left out, share it with someone who needs to hear it, because we dig up bloodlines exactly like this one every single week, backed by real published research, never folklore.